Welcome to Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone in the Libertarian Institute. This book is titled Black Slave Owners, Free Black Slave Masters in South Carolina, 1790 to 1860, by historian Larry Koger. Black slaveholding is a historical phenomenon which has not been fully explored by scholars. Graduate students of history are often surprised to learn that some free blacks owned slaves. Even historians are frequently skeptical until they discover the number of black masters and the number of slaves owned by them. Have they also consulted African literature to see if there were any slaves on the continent of Africa in the last 10,000 years or the Middle East? At the height of American slavery, the percentage of whites who owned slaves was less than 1%. To many readers, slavery was an institution exclusively utilized by white slave owners. The fact that free blacks owned slaves has been lost to the annals of history. Yet, at one time or another, free black slave owners resided in every southern state, which continuanced slavery, and even in northern states. In Louisiana, Maryland, South Carolina, and Virginia, free blacks owned more than 10,000 slaves, according to the federal census of 1830. Many of the black masters in the lower South were large planters who owned scores of slaves and planted large quantities of cotton, rice, and sugarcane. In 1860, for example, Auguste Donato, a free colored planter of St. Landry Parish in Louisiana, owned 70 slaves who worked 500 acres of land and produced 100 bales of cotton. About 600 miles to the east of Louisiana, in the county of Sumter, South Carolina, William Ellison, a free colored planter, used the labor of 70 slaves to cultivate 100 bales of cotton in 1861. In South Carolina, Robert Michael Collins and Margaret Mitchell Harris used their slaves to till the soil of Santee Plantation and grew 240,000 pounds of rice in 1849. But the majority of the large colored planters lived in Louisiana and planted sugar cane. So the leftist position that slavery is all about racism doesn't address all the slavery that existed before there was transport, such as ships, which were able to get different races to interact with each other. Thomas Sowell's lesson of slavery is the reason people were enslaved is not because of their race, they were enslaved because they were vulnerable. If it's slavery to force someone to pick cotton against their will, we have to be willing to say that to force someone to perform military service and get their limbs blown off and get killed against their will is also slavery. So, why is Vladimir Zelensky enslaving millions of men in Ukraine? Why is Vladimir Putin enslaving millions of Russians? Why did the American government enslave millions of white and black and Latino and Asian men into the American Civil War, the Vietnam War, the First World War, the Korean War, the Second World War? Because they were vulnerable. And what makes this bad is not the race of the people involved. Slavery is bad because it violates the principle of consent. It violates the non-aggression principle. In 1860, Madame Cyphrin Richard and her son, Pierre Richard, free mulattoes of Iberville Parish, owned 168 slaves. The joint operation of mother and son used the labor of slaves to produce 515 hog heads of sugar in 1859. Yet not all black masters were planters from the South. In fact, the city of New York had 8 black slave owners who owned 17 slaves in 1830. In short, the institution of black slaveholding was widespread, stretching as far north as New York and as far south as Florida, extending westward into Kentucky, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Missouri. Instead of playing the whites are terrible, blacks are virtuous game, why don't we just embrace the non aggression principle and say that's the lesson from slavery, that it's wrong to justify initiating violence against peaceful people and extrapolate the implications from that. Here are some quotes from Thomas Sowell. Nationwide, a majority, 54%, of all Black children were living with their mothers in 1992. However, this was not a legacy of slavery, as sometimes claimed. As recently as 1970, a majority of Black children were still living with both parents. Whatever the situation of the Black family relative to the white family in the past or present, it is clear that broken homes were more common among Blacks at the end of the 20th century than they were in the middle of that century or at the beginning of that century, even though Blacks at the beginning of the 20th century were just one generation out of slavery. From 1930 to 1934, 31% of first births to Black women were premarital, while from 1990 to 1994, 77% were. How can you blame this on the legacy of slavery when generations that were more closely uh, connected to slavery were less affected, and we did not see such a correlation between crime or the lack of care for education or the massive low impulse control that we see today? Makes much more sense to connect this to what Soul refers to as redneck behavior. Among Western Hemisphere nations, racial oppression was at its worst in the United States, especially in the former slave states of the South. Lynchings of Negroes peaked at 161 per year in 1892 in the United States. Realize governments murder that many people every day in warfare. While this phenomenon remained unknown in Latin America and the Caribbean, Haitian blacks, having been the most independent of whites for more than 2 centuries, should be the most prosperous in the hemisphere, and American blacks the poorest if racial oppression accounts for poverty. But in fact, their respective economic positions are directly the reverse, again, suggesting that human capital has a far greater effect than racial oppression. This was the point Walter E. Williams made in his book Race and Economics. He said, all right, so the problem in the world when it comes to what causes economic inequality or poverty is some races are racist to others. It's the discrimination explanation. He goes, all right, and if America's the worst offender of racism, we should see the poorest blacks in the world in America. According to his 2008 book, Race and Economics, American blacks on a per capita basis are the wealthiest blacks on the planet. That's who they're vilifying. Thus, the institution of slavery, existing on every continent and going back thousands of years, is often discussed as if it were peculiar to Western civilization, when, in fact, even the African slave trade was carried on by Arabs for centuries before Europeans took part and continued for at least another century after the European slave trade to the Western Hemisphere ended. At the heart of the story was the West's ending of slavery in its own domains within a century and maintaining pressure on other nations for even longer to stamp out this prejudice. Instead, the West had been signaled out as peculiarly culpable for a worldwide evil in which it participated, when in fact, its only real uniqueness was in ultimately opposing and destroying the evil. Although slavery in the United States was referred to as a peculiar institution, slavery was in fact one of the oldest and most widespread institutions on earth. Although slavery has come to be identified with the enslavement of Africans, that too ignores the long history and vast scope of the institution. The very word slave is derived from the Slavs who were enslaved on a massive scale and were often sold into bondage all across the continent of Europe and in the Ottoman Empire. In the 1820s, 6,000 Greeks were sent to Egypt as slaves, and half a century later, a report to the British Parliament noted that both white and black slaves were still being traded in Egypt and Turkey years after blacks had been emancipated in the United States. Perhaps the most important moral legacy of slavery is a keener appreciation of freedom. If the history of slavery ought to teach us anything, it is that human beings cannot be trusted with unbridled power over other human beings, no matter what color or creed any of them are. The history of ancient despotism and modern totalitarianism practically shouts that same message from the bloodstained pages of history. But that is not the message that is being taught in our schools and colleges or dramatized on television and in the movies. The message that is pounded home again and again is that white people enslaved black people. The treatment of white galley slaves was even worse than the treatment of black slaves who picked cotton, but there are no movies or television dramas about it comparable to Roots, and our schools and colleges don't pound it into the heads of students. The inhumanity of human beings toward other human beings is not a new story, much less a local story. There is no need to hide it because there are lessons we can learn from it. But there is also no need to distort it so that sins of the whole human species around the world are presented as special defects of our society or the sins of a particular race. Those who mine history for sins are not searching for truth, but for opportunities to denigrate their own society or for grievances that can be cashed in today at the expense of people who were not even born when the sins of the past were committed. If the Western world was so caring about the lives of whites and just didn't care about blacks at all, you have to really find it difficult to explain why the English civil wars of Oliver Cromwell took place and the elites were happy for hundreds of thousands of whites to get killed. The American Civil War that took place, the elites were happy to have hundreds of thousands of whites killed. How about the First World War? Millions of white deaths from the elite psychopath class. The Second World War, the most vilified country in all of human history, is white Germany, and today, the most vilified country in the world is white Russia. The problem is not whites are oppressing blacks or the elites are on the side of whites. You'd think if they were, they'd be doing every single thing in their power to stop the mass white death in Ukraine and Russia, but they just don't care. Not that they're trying to stop what's the genocide that's taking place in Gaza. The point is, they're opportunists. If they want to use race as something to pin one portion of society against the other in order to extract a high social status, they will do that. If ignoring it is beneficial, then they're going to happily ignore that. If nationalism is beneficial, they'll embrace that. If globalism is beneficial, they'll embrace that. Here is Thomas Sowell summarizing it. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. Again, military conscription by every definition of the word, the claim of ownership over another person, forced labor against their will in terrible conditions. I wouldn't say jury duty while it is technically forced labor. While technically a form of enslavement, it doesn't really meet the spirit of the threshold of enslavement. But military conscription, especially the Battle of Bakhmut in Ukraine, where the life expectancy, according to NBC, is 4 hours. Yeah, having military conscription in that is certainly worse than slavery. I'll end it with this quote right here. What can any society hope to gain by having some babies in that society born into the world with a priori grievances against other babies born into that same society on the same day? Could you imagine raising a son and every day telling him, you know, men are only 50% of the population, yet 95.5% of people killed by police. Therefore, that proves the police are sexist. Men have lower life expectancies than women. That's sexism. Men are 50% of the population, yet 90% of workplace deaths. That's sexism. Men are 50% of the population, yet the vast majority of homeless people. That is sexism. Don't try and work harder because that's just you being a part of the system. The only thing you can do is overthrow the system. Start getting together with your male friends and start rioting and start looting. That's how you change. Don't bother showing up to work on time. Don't bother getting on the job training. Don't try to have good impulse control. Don't value education. No, you have no control over this. It's all about the system. So put a lot of money into political candidates. Make sure you vote once every 4 years. That'll really change things. The only reason you would raise a son like that is if you wanted to basically have your son live a completely miserable life. But that is how Hollywood, the media, and academics and the Democrats are trying to raise Black America, constantly vilifying people for the color of their skin, while the content of the Democrats' character continues to get worse every single day you open Twitter. Thank you for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone in the Libertarian Institute.